Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. That was much better than last week. Thank you. Let's come to order over there, please. Class is started. If you would turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate or whatever it is you kids do, we would appreciate it. Next Tuesday, this room will be rocking because we're going to have West Liberty University's African Drum and Dance Ensemble here with Mitch Greco as director. And we will see some traditional West African drum and dance. So wear comfortable clothing. Week after that, we will take a look at Statue of Liberty, celebrating her 135th birthday in October. And yeah, that should be good. Today, we're going to hear about, and this was supposed to originally have been part of a week-long program called Celebrate Appalachia, which was postponed, but I had already invited Edward here, and I thought we should bring him in anyway because this is a new book from WVU Press, but it's really an old book, and he'll tell you all about that. It's called Cannel Coal Oil Days, and it is a novel written by his great-great-grandfather, Theophile Maher. And it's a fascinating book, which you'll hear about here in a minute. Edward here is a professor of English emeritus from Michigan State University. He drove all the way from Michigan to be here in Wheeling today. He's written, so make it worth his while. Have a little optimism. He's written or edited 9 other books, most recently Colonizing the Past, Myth-Making, and Pre-Columbian Whites in 19th-Century American Writing from University of Virginia Press. And like I said, he is the writer of this book he's going to tell you about. He's his great-great-grandson. Here's Edward Watts.
Thank you. All right, let me get settled here. There we go. Okay, thanks for coming out today. There's a copy of Theophile Maher's book coming around. So without further ado, for the last 3 decades, I've been teaching editing and writing about 19th century American literature and culture at Michigan State University. When my mother died in 2018, I inherited, or at least became curator of, the family archive she had collected. Without ever using the internet, she had assembled an impressive array of materials, some dating back to 17th century New Amsterdam. Among these, I found a 389-page handwritten manuscript. Oh, there's the title. There we go. There's the first page. Yeah, 389 pages of that, written on pages ripped from a stenographer's notebook from Woolworths. You can hold it up and see the watermark. Enclosed as well was a notebook in which my mother, also an English professor, had started transcribing the text by hand, which for modern editing is not really useful. She gave up after about 50 pages before it got good. The following winter, I read the whole thing and really liked it. And besides, it was right up my alley in terms of period and region, as I've long worked in the culture of the Ohio River Valley. Fortunately, a friend of mine at MSU was testing software that was designed to scan handwriting into Microsoft Word documents, and had funding for a graduate student to do the scanning. It went okay, but I still needed a few months to clean it up. And by the way, my friend said that handwriting recognition software is about 10 years behind voice recognition software, so don't hold your breath. I approached the project as a professional editor and literary historian, and not as the great-great-grandson of the author, Theophile Maher. There he is. Now, Theophile had long been somewhat of a nebulous figure to me in family history. I'd been named for his father, Edward St. Hilaire Maher, a French Huguenot, chased out of France by the French Revolution, and then chased out of Haiti by the Haitian Revolution. He landed in Philadelphia, where Gilbert Stuart somehow painted his portrait. I've still got that. I have no idea where it came from. On the other side, Theophile's son, George Maher, my great-great-uncle, is a semi-famous Chicago architect and early associate of Frank Lloyd Wright in the Prairie School. George built many houses and public buildings and even a cottage for his widowed sister, my great-great-grandmother, in 1910, which is still in the family. I stay there in the summer. Right now it's all closed up because it's fall. Between father and son, Theophile was something of an enigma. One reminder was two trees. When I was a child, two enormous white pine trees dominated the front yard in front of this cottage, so about where I'm standing, or when I took that picture. This is across the road from Lake Michigan, just south of Saugatuck, Michigan, where they used to go to escape the summer heat from Chicago. We called the trees, when I was young, Theophile and Sarah, after my great-great-grandparents, who first came to the area to escape the summer heat in the years after the Civil War. Theophile and Sarah, the trees, lasted about 100 years and died surrounded by dozens of their children, most of which still stands. It's still a pine forest there. As I engaged this project, however, I had to learn more, and there was a lot to learn. As a young man, Theophile trained as a chemical engineer in Paris, where he knew Alexandre Dumas, who wrote the Three Musketeers, and founders of the newspaper Le Figaro. Later, he unsuccessfully mined for gold in California and soon returned back east. At some point, he converted to Methodism, likely as part of the Second Great Awakening, 1800 to 1840, and his Christian values from then on strongly affected his work and life. He married Sarah Landis from Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1850. Named familiar, she was kinswoman to Kennesaw Mountain Landis, later the well-known commissioner of Major League Baseball. After their marriage, Theophile and Sarah relocated first to Chicago, where Theophile worked as a chemical engineer and refined new techniques in oil distillation before a fire destroyed his laboratory. From there, he settled in Cincinnati and later Kanawha County, Virginia, 10 miles up the Elk River from Charleston. Where that is. There we go. So here's Charleston. There's a red line on the map there, if you can see that. My son, who's a graphic artist, and therefore Theophile's great-great-great-grandson, helped me with that old map. So anyway, sorry, I lost my place. Yet, among all his various activities, a trek embodying the transformation of the United States from a divergent set of former colonies in the early 19th century to an industrial leviathan a century later, Theophile's time in the coal fields of West Virginia and his involvement there in the opening days of the Civil War most strongly struck his imagination. More precisely, his time implementing new processes for distilling oil more cleanly from Cannel Coal in a hamlet named Mill Creek off the Elk River's north bank, 10 miles upstream from Charleston. And that's not the better known Mill Creek in Jackson County in the northeastern part of the state. And organizing local efforts to secede from Virginia and to form a Union militia inspired the literary project he engaged as an older man. In 1887, he recreated these events with some embellishment in a semi-autobiographical novel, with you, Cannel Coal Oil Days, and the original subtitle was A Reminiscence of the War of Rebellion, whose subtitle was changed to a novel by West Virginia University Press to accentuate its fictional nature. Otherwise, it seems like nonfiction. Theophile's notes suggest that this is only the beginning of a larger text he had drafted but not completed. Those materials cannot be found. The text itself fictionalizes Theophile's time in Western Virginia as it became West Virginia, mostly through the eyes of Mr. Mark, his protagonist and stand-in. It begins with Mark's arrival in Charleston, then a village Maher refers to as the Kanawha Courthouse. I don't know why he does that. And traces his trip to Mill Creek via the Elk River. About what it looked like at that time. There he works as mining engineer for a Kentucky-based company set on improving the efficiency and production of its mining and distilling operations. The story continues through his entry into the mining community upstream, both white and enslaved. It minutely details how labor, transportation, education, religion, politics, economics, race, and at the center of it all, coal mining operated in the Kanawha Valley in the mid-19th century. The novel draws to a close with the arrival of a Confederate force into the staunchly Union stronghold as it comes up the Elk River to Mill Creek. Mark and his neighbors, all Lincoln Republicans, participate in and support the secession of West Virginia from Virginia and the nascent state's advocacy of both the abolition of slavery and loyalty to the Union. In the final scene, Mark allows himself to be captured by the rebels. At novel's end, he does this to avert a violent confrontation between the mountaineers and the Confederate troops. Although the surviving and incomplete manuscript ends abruptly, in the book itself, if you look in the back, I have included 3 appendices, one of which reproduces a 1901 newspaper story describing Theophile's own recollection of his brief captivity and later rescue by the Ohio Regiment. More artifact than art, Cannel Coal Oil Days brings to life a moment in West Virginia history largely overlooked in the materials available, that the materials available at this time do not, for this time and place, in a direct and straightforward manner in a novel with a number of subplots and undercurrents. As it was recently published, some explanation of the story itself and its 19th century contexts, such as mining history, Maher's use of local color literary style, his embrace of progressivism, the entanglement of slavery and mining, and the coming of war to Western Virginia should help us see how changes in mid-19th century Appalachia linger into the 21st. I call this a story of transformation. The division marked by the colon in the title between Cannel Coal Oil Days, the original title, and a reminiscence of the War of Rebellion captures the novel's 2 main narrative strains. While the division between mining and the run-up to war appears to represent 2 separate stories, in fact, each is a component of a larger story. The larger story of Mark as he brings reform and modernity to the region. To understand this, remember that as much as the novel depicts events in 1860, like all historical fiction in that sense, it also reflects the moment of its composition, in 1887. The narrative's first section described the entry of Mark to the region. The company owns 2,000 acres beneath which is Cannel Coal, a soft type of coal whose distilled oil was marketed for lighting in the years between the overfishing of the sperm whale population and the development of electric lighting. There was kind of gap. The company has put in charge 2 unqualified and corrupt men, and production and profits have been disappointing. Cannel Coal's mining and distillation were initially very messy and arduous, though early in the novel, Mark develops and puts in place methods for improving production and lessening its environmental impact. Most of the miners and laborers are enslaved people leased from slaveholders to the east in Old Virginia, as it's called. Once he understands their maltreatment and how that contributes to their unwillingness to work, Mark improves conditions once he wrests control from the previous incompetent and corrupt managers. Treated by Mark with dignity, the enslaved folk respond positively. The problem is not the blacks themselves, but the institution itself. Abolition and anti-racism characterize even the story's early mining-based sequences before moving to the center near the end. Throughout, Maher gives his readers glimpses into Mark's thoughts on various subjects. For example, as he awaits passage up the Elk River, in the fall of 1859, Mark contemplates slavery. So I'm going to read from the text for a moment. The loud claim of the South that slavery should be recognized as lawful property by the North and the territories, as well as the states, had come to the front as a national question. And the right of this claim was being stoutly denied at the North. So emphatic also was the protest that both shores, think about the Ohio, 200 yards from here is all, painfully and anxiously alive to the immediate and ultimate results of the impending clash. Mark's mind was deeply moved as he brooded upon the question, how long will this enchanting scene of peace, of plenty and quiet, happy homes remain unbroken by the terrible din and devastations of civil war? The greater portion of the passengers were Virginians from the salt licks and furnaces on the Kanawha, or traders living on that stream whose early limited training and whose family ties naturally bound them to the public sentiment of their state. On the other side, lifelong commercial associations with Cincinnati and other towns in the Ohio had enlarged their mental visions to see that the authority of a constitutional inseparable union must be paramount to a mere assertion of states' rights. in direct conflict with that authority for the universal recognition of a barbaric right of ownership in human flesh. Through its middle sequences, the social and mining themes then merge. The text follows the coal company's business through the experiences of Colonel Albert, one of its primary investors who comes up from Lexington to see how things are going. As he, his son, and Mark root out corruption, inefficiency, and the bad citizenship of the industry more generally, Mark and the Colonel engage in reforms that reflect, even now, ongoing concerns in the region: corporate integrity, racial conflict, and mining's history of environmental damage. Maher addresses these through the lens of the progressive ideology of his generation, one raised in the moment of the Second Great Awakening, a nationwide spiritual revival that inspired Americans to pursue not only abolition, but also temperance, women's rights, and labor reform, in the name of aligning the nation more closely with, in quotes, simple Christian values. In the novel's final third, as the Civil War approaches, interregional conflicts redirect the narrative. At this point, the primary enslaved family becomes tightly entangled with Mark, his wife Sarah, and their children, as well as the other Unionists in the neighborhood. At one point, he borrows from Harry Beecher Stowe. There's a famous scene in Uncle Tom's Cabin where the young white children of the plantation teach Uncle Tom and some of the other enslaved people to read. And so he creates a similar tableau at one point. Let's see. They also become entangled with other Unionists in the neighborhood. In particular, Mark interacts with the son, John, a Black who had purchased his freedom and is employed in Wheeling, where the proponents of seceding from the rest of Virginia have convened in the spring of 1861. John travels the region and dispenses information surreptitiously. Slaves often learn of developments well before the white character. You'd think it would be the reverse. That's not what Theophile is recording. Moreover, Mark trusts John with the militia's money to buy and smuggle much-needed gunpowder. So they sneak it buried within feed bags. So it's surrounded by feed coming up to the mine head, but then there's the gunpowder within that. And John delivers. John and his family embody values closest to Mark's own: faith, family, work, and service. Maher's representation of the Black population as articulate, resourceful, brave, and intelligent simply ignore stereotypical representations. These are presented silently, as if writing during Jim Crow in 1887. So this is, just a few years away from Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal, and all that noise. Maher depicts the morality, humanity, and patriotism of Blacks as too obvious to require further exposition. Local white Appalachians are also well represented. While there are some scurrilous types whose time is ended by Mark and the Colonel, of more interest are two types of the mountain's free white population. First are the teachers and the leaders. The school teacher, Mr. Clark, and the Reverend Freenbury devote themselves to the betterment of the mountain folk. Second are the mountain folk themselves. Early on, Mark explains how local settlers, squatters, had been cheated by wealthier landowners from eastern Virginia who forced them to pay rent on lands they had already cleared and farmed. Another quote. The ancestors of most of the men Mr. Freenbury was addressing had opened cornfields along the creek and upon the steep sides of the hills, on land which Virginia had, after the War of Independence, legislated to satisfy the claims of her soldiers. Most of their lands had been sold by the sheriff for non-payments of taxes. This happened all over the Midwest, in that you had squatters who came out here, cleared the land, started farming, and then were basically dispossessed as Eastern authority came in. And so most of the present owners under this dubious title were too glad to receive from their squatters their modicums of lease payment for the specified acres. Very few of these men and their wives could sign their names. Fewer still could read. Lamenting their deficiency, they took pride in their schoolhouse and supported with gladness the manly endeavor of Clark to redeem their children from the bondage of their own ignorance. So you have this kind of forward-moving narrative of the miners recognizing that it's more important for their children to be able to read and write and go to school. So absent from this than are any long-established stereotypical representations of white Appalachians as white trash, even in their views of blacks. Finally, the women of Mill Creek, in particular Sarah, Mark's wife, as well as Mrs. Drucker and Mrs. Johnson, both affirm and transcend sexist Victorian strictures of passive femininity. While each performs the standard role by personifying domestic virtue, each also speaks her mind. For example, Mrs. Johnson, so this is the wife of the manager of the mine, in particular confronts a Confederate soldier and convinces him to desert and to return to Kentucky and his wife. Now, as he tells these stories, Maher writes in the vein of local color realism, a way of writing dominant in the late 19th century. As industrialization, telegraphs, railroads, and wire services made each American place more alike, local color reminded them of earlier place-specific moments when communities were more self-contained, yet without fanning the flames of sectional difference. A kind of shared national narrative of a more rural, small town sort of background in the midst of urbanization. Although an inexperienced amateur writer, Maher joined with other local color writers to recraft this common nostalgia, a national memory of cooperation and community to heal the war's disruptions. For example, in describing Mark among his workers, both black and white, Maher writes, day and night, Mark was among them, one of them. And as he loved his work, so they loved theirs also, and tried to get a word from him about it at all times. Here, in this scene, an educated white northerner communes with working class white Appalachians and enslaved blacks as Maher crafts a tableau of shared experience, reversing the divisions made by the war and industrialism stratification and separation of regions, races, and classes. In many ways, this novel occurs on the borders that define 19th century America. North and South, black and white, modern and traditional, urban and rural, and middle and working classes. It exposes how these divergent presences might be reintegrated to heal the nation through inclusive values of Christian progressivism, simple kindness and respect. The Civil War disrupted the development of what could have been up Mill Creek or in any other American community, a profitable, clean, and multiracial place for families to live and work. Okay, that's the basic overview of the book. So now I'll try to anticipate a few questions that might arise from modern readers of the novel should you choose to read it. First, what were Theophile and his stand-in Mark doing up Mill Creek in the first place? Mining and distilling cannel coal. What is cannel coal? The first and middle sections of the novel, I'll show you a picture of it. There we go. It looks like coal, doesn't it? Describe at length Mark's modernization of his company's Cannel Coal Oil mining, distillation, and production processes. There are even scenes underground where they're trying to figure out where the property lines are, if they crossed lines. Long scenes, they're kind of dull, about how coal is made, how oil is distilled from coal, etc. So cannel coal, though, is very soft, malleable coal whose only current modern usage is handcrafted sculptures. It's soft enough, it's almost like halfway to clay. However, in the 19th century, as I said, it was briefly highly profitable when distilled and sold as an oil that could function in lamps developed to burn once abundant whale oil. In North America, cannel coal can be found especially throughout the Ohio Valley in an extended vein known as the Breckenridge Line. When Mark arrives in Charleston from Cincinnati, prior to going upstream to Mill Creek, he visits the company's distillery where the processed coal is converted to oil, which would then be shipped down the Kanawha to the Ohio and markets downstream. When he is appointed director of the mine and other operations at Mill Creek, the retorts and still are described, as are the resulting tar, ash, coke, and other byproducts. And both in Charleston and at Mill Creek, he finds ways of leaving less waste. It's spoiling the water, it's poisoning the water, it smells horrible. And so he finds means of circumventing some of that waste that clean up the water, that make the company more popular down in Charleston because they had a huge waste pile next to the river. And they burn it on a day when the wind is from the right direction, and then it's gone. So he's thinking about those things too. So when Mark arrives, he considers it his duty to find cleaner and more efficient means of refining the entire process. After the first year, the streams have been cleaned, the distillation machinery has been shifted to the mouth of the mine itself, and cleaner and better oil is being produced at a lower cost. However, this is why you haven't heard of cannel coal. The cheapness of cannel coal and other coal oils, even in 1861, was quickly becoming a moot point. From the start, Maher positions the discovery and improved production of petroleum and kerosene as a constant threat to the commercial viability of coal oil. At the time, as described by Henry Ernie, a historian, in 1865, actually he was writing a manual on how to make coal oil. Coal oil was extracted first by superheating it in retorts. That's a retort. So you load in the raw coal, you'd superheat it, and at the top, you would collect what was distilled, and it would lead to then a tank. Then it would have to be refined after that as well. The resulting vapors were piped into condensers where they were treated with alkalis to clean and purify the distilled oil. In 1865, Abraham Gessner, whose father had pioneered the distillation of coal oil in the 1840s, published a book called A Practical Treatise on Coal, Petroleum, and Other Distilled Oils. These are really interesting books to look at because these days it all seems so very complicated, but they break it down for amateurs coming into the field at the time who probably had some chemical, some training in chemistry, but it wouldn't have been that difficult to follow the directions on how to do this. So anyway, this book is a general history and how-to as it developed prior to the Civil War. Gessner begins by noting the potential of coal oil. Beginning in the 1840s, he comments, the refining process was not so well understood at that time as at present, and the odor was not agreeable. The beauty of the light from it, however, was sufficient to gradually overcome the objection on the score of odor. Its supposed explosiveness was also urged against it by those interested in the camphene and burning fluids. Gessner notes that the progress in coal oil's production methods had been gradual and carried on not by the laborers of one mind, but by many, so as to render it difficult to discover to whom the greatest credit is due. And that sounds very modern, right? We think of invention as happening in isolated individuals, but is conceding its collective nature here. Gessner prefaced these remarks by noting that the seeming irreversible slide of coal oil into obsolescence. The great cheapness of oil procured by the distillation of petroleum has, however, almost caused the coal distillation to be suspended. This was writing in 1865, so after the time Theophile was in Mill Creek. And it will be resumed because the petroleum wells, only when the petroleum wells cease to yield sufficient oil for their various purposes to which it is now applied, thinking that someday if we run out of petroleum, maybe we will, but not now. Of course, writing in 1865, Gessner could not know that Thomas Edison would soon make petroleum as a lighting source irrelevant, and that Henry Ford would find other uses for petroleum itself. Next question. How did local color literature and Christian progressivism affect how Theophile told his story? Having spent time in the 1850s and as a staunch Republican and abolitionist, Maher was likely familiar with its prominent literary figures and shared their political and cultural values. In 1840, Cincinnati was the fourth leading literary center and publishing center in the United States. There was a very healthy, active literary scene, lots of famous people, famous to me. I wrote a book about this about 20 years ago. And so there was a noise, there was an energy that undoubtedly someone like Theophile would have picked up on in his time in Cincinnati. A young figure coming out of this was William Dean Howells, who perhaps you've heard of. Howells later moved to Boston to edit The Atlantic and later to New York to edit Harper's. Following patterns developed by Victor Hugo, Charles Dickens, and Leo Tolstoy, Howells advocated for a publicly accessible, realist fiction that modeled Christian morals and social reform. Local color was a component of Howells's realist literary project. Literary historian Paul Abeen describes this writing as imbued with, quote, a practical sense of Christian ethics, religious tolerance, and a drive to peaceful social activism. Maher's own cosmopolitan exposure to these global practices in 19th century literary writing, such as his exposure to Hugo while a student in Paris, can be seen throughout Cannel Coal Oil Days. Now, up Mill Creek, Mark asserts these values by embodying them, not through confrontation, but simply by integrating them into his daily life and work. For example, as he travels upstream on Drucker's boat, so Drucker is the guy who runs the boat up the Elk River from Charleston to Mill Creek, Mark politely asks about the availability of Sunday services in the area. This makes Drucker recall his own lapse of faith. Without proselytizing, Mark manages to get Drucker to realize the error of his ways, and Drucker becomes a regular congregant at Frainbury's services. Most important, Mark's abolitionism is rooted in his Christian values. One exchange with the colonel allows him to articulate his views. Another longer quote. "I thought you was a Republican, Mr. Mark," said the colonel, smiling. "From your whole makeup, you are very radical in your mind and your ways, fond of digging to the root of everything and find out what it is." "Yes, Colonel, no search, no find, but no compromise ever with malice, error, or conceit when the well-being of and the union of our country hang in the balance. God gave it to us to keep one and undivided for our children and transmit it to them as we received it from our fathers. Slavery is one of the large parasites that have gradually grown upon our nation as its excrescences do grow day and night. They suck our life's blood and should be cut off." End quote. Yet Mark utters these beliefs only when pressed, and the colonel had to kind of pull this out of him. He cannot free or change the legal status of the enslaved workers, but he can make their lives better in a number of ways. First, by improving conditions in the mines, the works, and their dwellings. He demonstrates concern for their safety and health. Second, by insisting on cash payments that allow them to pay in cash for their own necessities, he frees them to make their own choices or even to save toward purchasing their freedom. So, the enslaved people working on the mine were given tokens to go down to Charleston to buy their own clothes or anything like that, but they could only go to certain merchants. And so the corrupt mine managers prior to Mark would work with those merchants, get a cut, there was some draft, and low quality stuff was all they could buy. So when Mark arrives at the mine head, the enslaved people are in rags, they look terrible, they're underfed. And these are leased slaves, so they really don't care, rent a mule, right? And Mark changes all that. Okay, third, Mark hires a colored Baptist preacher to offer them services where they might be most comfortable. Finally, when the opportunity comes, he not only advocates for their freedom, but takes concrete steps through the organization of a militia. Mostly, though, he simply treats blacks as humans, respecting their needs and conceding his own reliance on them, a rarity in white authored late 19th century fiction. On the whole, despite his education and worldliness, Mark treats the denizens of the Kanawha Valley, white and enslaved, with respect and equanimity. After the white mountain folk, the boatman Drucker and the manager of the mine Johnson, though uneducated, are virtuous and honest professionals, and so merit his respect. In addition, neither Johnson nor Drucker is racist, but rather share Mike's Republican and liberal views. For instance, Drucker staffs his ferry with whites because blacks are unmotivated, not because of any intrinsic inferior based on skin color. He says, "I don't blame the poor creatures, however much, as I do their masters for raising them as they do from the day they are born to be lazy as they are." To be lazy as they are. In other words, this was a common argument going back to Ben Franklin, that slavery not only damaged the enslaved people, but also damaged the whites who were reliant upon other people doing things for them all the time. And these are old arguments in the abolitionist set of arguments. Okay. Treated humanely by Mark, the enslaved blacks strip off the masks they had donned to survive the indignity of slavery and reveal the intelligent and diligent personalities they had previously concealed. Even before Mark's appearance, Johnson had long trusted the semi-autonomous leased miners to work unsupervised underground and at all hours. Maher describes Mark creating a community in Mill Creek, one in which the neighbors of different races, colors, and classes and genders might live together in peace. Okay, But Cannel Coal Oil Days is a novel, right? This all sounds very nice. What was the reality of slavery and mining in antebellum West Virginia? In a book called Black Coal Miners in America, Race, Class, and Community, Conflicts, 1987, Ronald L. Lewis begins with a section on leased slaves working in the coal mines of Appalachia. Fortunately for me, he focuses on the Kanawha Valley in particular. Before 1850, as many as 3,140 slaves mined the region's land to fire salt furnaces. After 1850, most leased workers were switched to cannel coal mining and processing, as 46 coal oil companies operated in the region between 1846 and 1861. So there were a lot of these companies pretty much on every hollow up the Kanawha and Elk valleys. In the novel, the previous manager Reynolds' abusive treatment of the slaves prior to Mark's arrival seems typical. Lewis even describes one company that penned up their leased slaves at night, putting them in cages to keep them from escaping to Ohio. Well, Reynolds never goes that far. As I said, he works very hard to cheat them out of what little self-determined they have been agreed to in the leasing agreement. Non-slaving Appalachians whites, however, reflect a more accepting perspective. Lewis, the historian, explains the source of this ambivalence. In the Kanawha, he writes, slavery was primarily an economic matter of cheap labor. Since the institution of slavery was not the foundation of Western Virginian society, there was no overpowering need to demonstrate ideological allegiance to the institution by the white settlers. Local whites did not resent slaves, as the labor market had no surplus, and besides, mining was dangerous and unpleasant work. In the novel, the whites easily admit themselves abolitionists, not to remove slaves as a threat to their employment or underpayment, but simply because slavery contrasts with their Christian values. Very few people in Western Virginia actually owned slaves, only about 1%, according to Mark A. Snell. Much more like the Northerners across the Ohio River than the Eastern Virginians across the mountains. Western Virginia's economy did not depend on slave labor, and poor white identity was not simply defined in opposition to Black identity. On the whole, then, with regard to race, economics, and industry, Western Virginia had long diverged from the Richmond-based East long before 1861 in both documented history and in the novel. Small wonder that when a crisis arose, Western Virginia voted to become West Virginia. Having set up these distinctions, Maher brings the story into 1861 and the coming of war and secession, both kinds, to the Kanawha Valley. So then, did Maher and Mark participate in debates surrounding the secession of West Virginia? Yes. On studying the sources of Virginian intrastate divergence in the 1850s, so divergence within Virginia, Richard H. Owens notes that citizens in the north and northwest sections of the state complained that they were treated as the vassals of the eastern politicians. They believed their taxes were levied and increased for the benefit of the easterners. Internal improvements such as canals and railroads to connect western areas to eastern markets, or as links to the Ohio Valley and western states, were always a divisive issue. If you look up internal improvements nationally for this period, like canals, levees, roads, the north is becoming just a web in the antebellum decades. Railroads, and the south just has hardly anything, no bridges, no anything like that. Obviously, Western Virginia has to be more part of that industrial north, where transportation and such is needed to enable the growth of the country. And the Eastern Virginians were just not having it. That's what the historians show. For example, the Kanawha Valley had not been made more navigable through dredging and banking as had been the rivers. You know, I skipped a slide. I'm sorry. They're black miners. My students always complain I'd always be off a few slides. The Kanawha River had not been made more navigable through dredging and banking, as had been the rivers used by mining companies in northern states like Pennsylvania and Ohio. In West Virginia history, Otis Rice and Stephen Brown, this is the comprehensive history of the state, maybe some of you are familiar with it, lay out in great detail the process by which Western Virginia seceded from Virginia itself, as does Maher in the novel. As the war approaches, Mark repeatedly reads to his family, the workers, and the relieved slaves from Republican papers in Wheeling and Cincinnati delivered by Drucker. And also, they're delivered by John and Isaac, the self-freed ex-slaves. The Western counties held a popular referendum, as Maher describes, on May 23rd, a little more than a month after Virginia had voted to secede from the Union. The vote to secede from Virginia was very close, though not in the Kanawha Valley, where it was cleared by a large majority. The new state did not immediately ban slavery, and so it existed as a border state during the war, unaffected by the Emancipation Proclamation. Only after the passage of the 13th Amendment was what little slavery remained banned from West Virginia. True to the post-bellum spirit, again, he's writing in 1887, of reconciliation in his own Christian epic of forgiveness, Maher refuses to wave the bloody shirt, as a lot of Northerners did, to demand punishment of the South for the war or even for his own brief captivity. Maher depicts Southern soldiers sympathetically, such as the one convinced by Mrs. Johnson to return home. Maher only depicts the leaders as a problem: General Henry Wise and Major Crone. Former Virginia Governor Wise had been sent west on a recruiting mission. Didn't work. The boatman director articulates the local response. He says, "The old fool, he don't know us yet with all his knowing. The Kanawha is not Richmond. Let him try and send his brave chaps or greenhorns up the Elk. And if they don't learn how to throw their guns and run like hounds before they have made 4 miles, my name is not Drucker." When Wise realizes this and anticipating the arrival of Union forces, Wise plans a retreat. He had miscalculated the left's difference and loyalty to Old Virginia. As such, he is a nuisance, but never violent or immoral. On the other hand, Crone, who invades Mill Creek to capture Mark, he is eager to to be violent to do so, is a dangerous drunk. While Crone's men arrive to capture him, Mark realizes that Crone's drunken affront will lead only to the suffering of his neighbors and the destruction of the mine and the works. He surrenders. Reflecting Maher's views on temperance, again stated but never sermonized, Crone's dangerous decisions and violence are based on his being drunk as much as anything else. He's reckless. In the post-war moment where he was writing, Maher, whose own captivity was brief, again imagines healing rather than further division. Nonetheless, one of the novel's most important moments is when Mark, his wife Sarah, and their friends take a strong stand to help the Kanawha area vote to secede from Virginia. When the western counties conducted their referendum, Mark, as had Maher himself, realized that there were no American flags in the Charleston area to rally support at the polling station for seceding from Virginia. In the novel, at Sarah's demand that she must sew a functional stars and stripes, Mark enlists the former slave John to bring from Wheeling the necessary silk bunting that Sarah can then sew into an American flag. With the help of Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Drucker, Sarah sews the flag. Mark and Sarah take it to Charleston, where he speaks on a stump, literally, stump speech, urging the local vote in favor of separation. However, in a series of much later versions of the story, published around the turn of the century by newspaper journalists, included in the book as appendices, so in the back of the book, based on an interview with Theophile and Sarah, one was published in the Evanston, Illinois press. An anecdotal history of the flag and Sarah's obituary are 2 of the other appendices. And they likewise exclude Black and Appalachian contributions to what is presented as an act of patriotism performed exclusively by the white educated classes. So in the novel, John's contribution and the women's contribution are crucial to getting this flag up and flying. But in the newspaper stories in Jim Crow America, they're left out. And it's just Sarah making the flag and Theophile giving the speech. Okay. This allows the reporter to tell a more marketable story of a charming and comfortable old white woman in a picturesque Wilmette cottage, acting only as an adjunct to her husband's more direct and public patriotism. By contrast, the novel downplays Theophile's stump speech. Again, he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. I cannot find a text of the speech. I really wish I could. He just says Mark gave the speech and then moves on. Okay, so but regardless of which version is factual, Cannel Coal Oil Days memorializes the flag-making event as a collaborative effort that involved Blacks, Appalachians, and women, patriotic accomplishment that crossed the lines of race, class, and gender. Okay, in conclusion, Cannel Coal Oil Days is a lost, though somewhat flawed treasure now found. The novel brings to life a long lost moment of transition and transformation. Appalachia has long suffered in the national story as a backwater, a place well behind most of the rest of the nation in regard to modernization and progress. Cannel Coal Oil Days offers an alternative Appalachia, one where the mountaineers fight for freedom, and features a coal company manager determined not to exploit the workers and the land for the sake of immediate profit. Although a cosmopolitan outsider who traveled the world, Maher found Up the Hollow a place of opportunity and innovation, and not just a testing site for innovative mining technologies, but also a proving ground for larger practices of social progress and moral reformation. Given all the experiences he could have addressed from Paris to California, Maher found the story most worth telling among his friends and colleagues of Mill Creek, West Virginia. Thanks very much. Questions, comments, your own stories?
We have a question from online.
Okie doke.
Read it first.
Sure. Elizabeth asks, how much agency are Black and enslaved individuals given within the narrative? I would love to hear you touch more on their perspective. Okay, there are a couple things. When Mark goes up to Mill Creek, the enslaved people who were up there have been abused by Reynolds, the previous manager. He's cheated them, he's underfed them, he's underclothed them. They have to sneak out at night to get access to clean water from a different stream because the stream closest to their quarters is contaminated. Okay, so when Mark first meets the old kind of patriarch of the whole group, it's when he's staying up all night watching the mine, and he talks to the guy. Why are you going way over there to get water when you could just get it here? Well, he learns about the water being polluted from that. Okay. After that, then I think it's mostly the son John who has bought his own freedom. I know Frederick Douglass, other people like that bought their own freedom as well. And he really takes the initiative. He works in Wheeling, but he comes back to his family on the Kanawha. And yes, it's Mark's realization that they don't have any gunpowder and they need gunpowder because the Confederates are going to be there soon. Or Sarah's realization that they need a flag. And they say, hey, Mark, or hey, John, would you go to Wheeling to go take care of this? And off he goes. Clearly, you know, the educated white male is still in a position of authority. But at the same time, this man shows initiative. He's bought his own freedom. He's traveling under cover of night. He is smuggling gunpowder in, and the militia is all white as well. Nobody's going to arm the slaves. That would be a very unpopular and difficult thing, I think, to do at the time. So to answer Elizabeth's questions, then I'd say it's somewhat limited, but I'd also say that it's nascent. And I think the other context you need to keep in mind for that at the time too is, again, when Theophile was writing in 1887, right, Reconstruction's over. The Jim Crow laws are coming in en masse. The Klan is growing everywhere. And the representations of Black people in American literature is not good, okay? Mostly they're depicted as either savages or ignorant, people acting like clowns. And so they have these people just in the novel as people in 1887, much more like you'd see in a Black writer like Charles Chestnut or someone like that, than in, you know, Ned Buntline, Joel Chandler Harris, people like that, as the Uncle Remus stories. Theophile was, you know, using local color, but I think he was more sensitive to race, but certainly not the way we would think of a more perspective, a more modern perspective. But I think he was on the trail towards a more modern way of thinking about that. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Well, it may be
Is coal oil, but it's not cannel coal oil. So the process of grinding the coal and getting the vapors from it that are then distilled into oil is different. I think in the 1850s, you really saw a rush towards cannel coal because it was so much easier to handle and easier to get out of the ground. But yeah, the Breckenridge line, and if you look up cannel coal, if you just do a Google search these days, kind of stretches and kind of bends up that way, almost to the Wabash Valley, which is where you would have been, right?
yeah, but the town I was born in was on the wall.
Well, there you go. So not far from Vincennes, a little north of Vincennes.
North.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we always called it coal oil.
Yeah, and it is coal oil, but it's not cannel coal oil. So this is a different. I should have brought some to pass around. I'm sure you can find some local history. It's yes, ma'am.
It was like 2 minutes. Coal.
Not even coal in it.
It's somewhere between coal and peat, probably. I really need to have my wife here, who's a chemist. she would help us with this. But yeah, the thinking was it was easier to distill, it was easier to, and the thinking too was that especially the techniques that I think Theophile and he has Mark developed had to do with it burning more cleanly and less smelly and less chance of exploding. I think with kerosene was that they worried about it exploding. So as I was explaining beforehand to one of you all the houses, and I'm sure there's still some around here too, had gas, oil vents, I should say, that you light, and then that would be your lighting at night, right? Because candles were dangerous and difficult in some places as well. So when the sperm oil ran out, and if you Moby Dick fans out there, Moby Dick was really at the end of the whale oil moment. New Bedford was about ready to go from being this, amazing, busy seaport to being kind of a backwater. Because of the whale oil running out, you already had all this equipment in the houses that people knew how to use. Are you going to, replace all this with something else in the houses? No. So they were looking for the next oil, the next technology in a way that was going to allow there to be safe, non-smelly lighting. And the equipment was already there. So coal oil, as I said, there was really a boom in the late 1840s up until about the start of the Civil War for cannel coal. But as I said, it was quick. And it was over, and Theophile was on to something else after the war. Anything else? Well, I hope if you get a chance to look at it, you do. It's a good book. And as I said, I tried to approach this project not as Theophile's great-great-grandson, but rather as a literary historian. And there's a gap. There are a lot of really good texts out there, some of them sitting in Woolworth steno pads, some of them in boxes in libraries that just haven't seen the light of day. And as we get more and more of those out in the open, the more we'll know about what life was really like. And we're less beholden to the versions of the past that have been handed down to us from biased sources. And in the conclusion, in the intro, I make a little bit more of the two different versions of these stories of the flag at the end of the book, because the newspapers back then were very much beholden to these corporate interests and all that. But for them, this kind of picturesque, white woman sitting in this nice cottage in Wilmette with a nice story. But at the same time, you have this long legacy of Appalachian whites being in backwoods. We still have, unfortunately. Okay, and we have the blacks wouldn't participate in this as well. And so, again, I don't know which version is most accurate, but in the novel, Theophile really wanted the alternate version. And so, I'd rather believe that one anyway. Yes, sir.
your great-great-grandfather, he never tried to have it published?
No, as far as I know, he didn't.
Did he just, it ends, he just sort of trails off? And just,
Well, no, as I said early on, he makes reference at one point that more will be coming. And the subtitle was A Reminiscence of the Civil War. And it really, the book ends as the war starts. Now, Theophile during the war himself, by this time he was already 45 and a little old to be out there as a soldier. So they had him doing engineering logistics up in Ohio. So he left Mill Creek after this because it was kind of contested territory. And the leased slaves, of course, were withdrawn back to Virginia as far as I've been able to figure out. Okay, so he wasn't, fighting in the war, but it was still important to him to tell the story. So that would have been kind of a boring story. I went up to, somewhere in Eastern Ohio and, did clerical work for a few years. This is more of an adventure. So it's more about the coming of the war than the war itself. So now his son, as I said, George Maher, though, if you want to Google him, he has a wiki page. He built loads of houses in Philadelphia and Chicago, built public buildings. There's a town north of Chicago where he laid out a lot of the design. And so a lot of what I've been able to learn about Theophile is from a couple architectural historians who studied his work in Chicago. And so they've been trying to decipher what was going on with him and where he was getting some of the ideas. And so they've dug up a lot of family history. So it was very helpful to me to have access to that. His son was also manic depressive and killed himself. An artist, Anything else? Okay, Sean? Sorry? Oh, the book is available from West Virginia University Press on Amazon, a number of other places if you Google it. Maybe it'll show up in some stores eventually, but it's a university press book, and I wanted it to go through the university press. And the editors, the director of the press, were very excited to have something there. And I thought it was important too. I sent it in, again, not as his great-great-grandson. And so it went through the normal academic peer review. And that's something we do in academia, where you send manuscripts out to people who don't know the project, but kind of know the field. And they have to basically answer the question, should this be published? I do this a lot for other people's projects. And the people who West Virginia University Press sent it out to said yes, without knowing my connection to the personal connection to the project. So it's a legit text, and the folks at West Virginia University Press were very excited about it. So, but a hard time to publish a book right now. You can't get out to book fairs or shows, conferences or conventions, normally the places where you sell academic presses. So, thanks. Thanks again for being here.